This is really exciting. This is exactly what we needed at this time right here. I'd like all the front people to go ahead and leave. I want all the PDC people to come up front because I think we deal with the most mental distress and challenges mentally that anybody's ever seen based on just our senior staff. Anyway, no, it was a little joke. Anyway, very excited to have Erin here. Erin has a company called Peace of My Mind. She deals with mental stress and very significant challenges and problems. And we are so excited because this has been a tough year in hospice. It's been a tough year everywhere. But we have had not only our group go through stress, but our employees. So what we're hoping to glean is some real insights from you. And also, we have an audience watching online. And yesterday, that's what they brought up. Can we deal with stress? The stresses that our employees have been feeling, and what do we do, and ways that we might be able to help those employees be more successful working kind of remotely, out of touch. It's exciting. So we're so glad that you're here. With no further ado, come and do anything you want to us. Do everything you want.
Perfect. Thank you, thank you, thank you. So how is everyone? Good? What time did y'all eat lunch today?
11. We got back an hour.
Okay, so I'm not like right after lunch because that is the hardest time to present. So I appreciate that. My name is Erin, and like was mentioned, I have a company called Peace of My Mind, and our mission is really about reducing stigma related to mental health and normalizing conversations about it. So as many of you I'm sure know, mental illness is not always fun or sexy to talk about. However, mental health conditions impact almost every one of us. If it hasn't impacted you, your time is coming. So keep that in mind, whether it's somebody you work with, somebody you know. And so I'm going to share a little bit about my own experience, and I'm going to merge that with some of my professional experience. So I've been in the world of mental health, domestic sexual violence, trafficking, and trauma for almost 13 years. And kind of in that whole process, I'll share with you how I ultimately was able to create success and overcome some challenges and some barriers and create cultures within the workplace of supportive and empowering mental health responses, not only from a leader and a director position, but also from kind of an entry-level staff. So for today's presentation, we're going to start off, this is a little bit about what we're going to chat about. Now, I'm hoping that today can be interactive, that you're going to ask questions, that you're going to share your experiences, so we can really utilize the time and space that we have here together. So if you have questions along the way, shout them out. We don't have to hold them all to the end, but I certainly will make sure that we do have time, to talk about either specific scenarios or concerns that you all might have, while minding confidentiality and things like that. And then I'll kind of give you a preview of some of the different types of training and facilitation courses that I offer as we wrap up today. So one thing I want to recognize is that, one, stigma sucks, and it makes it really difficult for people to seek help. It makes it difficult for them to disclose at the workplace, to their friends or families. And if we're struggling with our own mental health, it can make it really difficult to connect or show up, like emotionally show up in the work that we do. Now, you all have a hard job. I can't fathom doing the work that you do. So hats off to you. Greatly appreciate you. I know it's kind of a thankless job. I have a sense of that working in trauma and the mental health world. But I want to talk about, what are the different ways that we carry implicit biases about who mental illness impacts, and then looking at what are some strategies that we all can use personally in our own lives to reduce stress, increase self-care, from a workplace perspective. What can you do to take care of each other, those that you supervise? And then, overall, what are some tools that we can use to, I hope I'm not supposed to be keeping an eye on that chat box, just FYI. And what are some tools that we can do to enhance our own awareness of maybe when we need to pause or check in with a team member or a supervisor or our friends or our family or our kiddos, because, challenges oftentimes arise. So this is the world that we live in today. And this is really, I think, in alignment with mental health and physical health and a lot of fear and stigma that surrounds that. So how many of you have ever wondered when you're walking throughout your community, in your city, you're in the grocery store, how many of you have ever wondered, like, other people behind the mask, like, what is their life like? Are they happy? Are they sad? Or you meet someone who's super disgruntled and we sort of like assign assumptions about their experience or what they're going through. We kind of pull our judgy pants on a little more when we can't see someone's entire face. Do we feel that way? Kind of? Okay, so it's not just me. So oftentimes what we see is just like mental health. We're living in a world today where we all have to wear masks. We're only showing up and people only have a perception of what our experience is. And when it comes to mental health, you can't look at a person and recognize whether they're struggling with a mental illness. There is not one look, there is not one type of behavior. Mental illness does not discriminate against any of us. So oftentimes, for folks living with a mental health condition, they may feel as though they have to keep sort of that mask on. So when they go to work, they maybe don't want anybody else to know that they're struggling with their mental health, or they have a diagnosis, or that one of their children has been diagnosed, because there's such many times fear and shame around, how am I going to be viewed? Or what if the clients or patients or customers that I serve find out that I'm living with a mental illness, or find out I'm taking time off to take care of my own mental health? So think about how stigma plays out. I think this is a good representation of what happens in our society. So on the left, you have a jar that says, please help Joey get a new kidney. And it's like overflowing with money. And the family's like happy, and little Joey has a heart above his head. And then over here, when it comes to mental health, it says, please help. Jamie needs psychiatric care. We are desperate. And I'm not gonna lie, Jamie looks kind of whacked out. There's like 32 cents in there. And so when you look at this, question out to all of you, how do you think this speaks to individuals living with mental health conditions? They're not as important.
Then it's not by accident, and you caused something.
You caused it, right? Like when we see little Joey, it's like something that happened to him, and he's sort of like a victim of this illness. Whereas when mental health, it's kind of like, well, what'd you do wrong? What else comes to mind? What are messages that play out when this is the perception of mental illness compared to physical health? It's not a real thing. Like, I always crack up when people are like, it's all in your head. I'm like, that's exactly where it's at. It is absolutely in your head. And we want to make sure that we take care of our brains just the way we take care of our hearts and our organs and our body as a whole. And so when we look at how to reduce stigma or acknowledge that stigma is present, one, silence perpetuates stigma. So when we don't talk about mental health, when we don't talk about mental illness, people aren't going to reach out for help. They will absolutely be impacted in the workplace. And there's a variety of different types of stigma. So there's public stigma, what might some examples of that be? Like, what are messages you hear from the public or maybe in the media about mental illness?
See the news stories about the bad things that happen when people have an event or...
Yeah. So it's often so focused on the negative or a trauma or a violent tragedy. It's rarely like Carlos started a nonprofit in his community and he's living with a mental illness and now has a summer camp for kids with mental illnesses. Like, we don't hear those stories. And so public, right, none of us in this room, but publicly in our society, we often say that people living with mental illnesses are never going to go anywhere. They're drug users. They're weak. They should have tried harder. There's a lot of cultural and racial implications. And overall, not everybody has the same access to services. Not everybody has that same access to help. So while we could tell an individual or we could refer patients to other services, my experience in what's available to me is going to be different than the next person. And that's going to depend on who my social supports are, my insurance, my drug or alcohol history, my fears of reaching out. So stigma plays into this conversation a whole lot. There's a table right there in case you wanted to know. So I was diagnosed with bipolar disorder when I was 17. So this is sort of how I thought about it. I'm like, all right, so I'm over here. I'm now the bipolar girl. And then here's all the normal non-lunatics in the other fishbowl. So even though I had a supportive family, even though I didn't have mental illness, didn't run in my family, so I was the starter for that, I feel proud of. There wasn't a lot of conversation in my hometown about mental illness. It was like, if you had a mental illness, don't talk about it. Like, it kind of labels the family, it can feel shameful. And so it really put a halt on my life when I was in high school. So without having a lot of symptoms, I sort of had a really quick, acute onset manic episode. And so with that, I ended up journaling a lot about my experience. So these are some things that I had written down when I was 17. I'm a weak member of the mentally ill, being moved along in life like a herd of infected cattle. Crazy girls like me are looked upon as a lost cause and only useful for dinnertime gossip. I have to live with this title forever, like it's some kind of dog tag hanging around my neck. So if you want to know what it's like getting diagnosed with a mental illness, this is it. I didn't ask for it when I was younger, and they do those tests about like, what do you want to be when you grow up? Mental illness was not on there. I promise I didn't check it. And so while diagnoses can be beneficial, right? Oftentimes it provides answers. It gives a path to like the appropriate therapeutic modality and medication and support systems and programming. But there is a lot of shame and stigma and frustration that comes with those diagnoses as well, because they follow you around forever. And so when I was diagnosed, I went from living a really wonderful life with a supportive family. I grew up in Flagstaff, which is about 2 hours north of here in the mountains. It's beautiful. They talk a lot in small towns, so if you're going to get diagnosed with mental illness, have like a larger population. And so at that time, I struggled with the shame. I struggled with the stigma that some of that I placed on myself of like, I'm never gonna succeed. How am I ever gonna get a job? Who's gonna hire me? I don't really know if I can do it. And that goes back to those messages that fly around in families and communities of what it means to live with a mental illness. And I use that terminology intentionally because that's different than what it's like suffering from a mental illness. I definitely suffered for years. Like, you couldn't pay me enough money to believe that I'd be standing here at 36 doing this today. I was not like this many, many years ago. And so as a way to kind of cope with that, when we look in the context of trauma, right? When somebody's experiencing trauma and they no longer have utilization of coping skills that previously worked for them, that's where they go to, other types of coping mechanisms. And so for me, I feel like the only things I had control of in my life was what I ate and the type of harm I created for myself or others. And so I did a lot of self-harm my senior year. I was hospitalized multiple times. I was put on medication, which caused a lot of side effects. And so I really struggled with weight gain, and I thought, well, that's something I can control. And so we added an eating disorder on top of that list for several years. And at the end of the day, I think anybody who has family or friends or you yourself are living with a mental health condition, like there's this point in time. There's this point in time where it's like, I have autonomy and choice and some agency in how I move forward in my life. And so I was able to get to a place where I recreated and changed the messages I told myself about my ability and about my future. I mean, at 17, I was shipping off to college to do what I was going to do in my career. After being medically withdrawn from college, that was put on halt. So my question or my hope for all of us is we can look at what are your views of mental illness? What are your views about how you manage your own mental health and stressors at work? What coping skills do you have available to you that are working? Which ones are outdated? And then how do you perceive those that you serve and work with? There's this notion that like being sick or getting older is automatically tied to depression and mental health issues. And that's just like not safe messaging. Getting older is a privilege, and the link to depression as though that's just absolutely a part of life is something that, we strive to kind of speak out against. So one of the things we want to do, obviously, learn to recognize mental health. So as you look at mental health, one, we all have it. We've got mental health over here on this very left far side, right? So this is all of us here in this room, like just really centered and grounded, focused. We're emotionally well. We're managing good work relationships. We have safe functioning relationships in our personal life. For those of us who are like, I don't fit into that category, we might be more in the middle section. And these aren't like diagnosed mental illnesses. This is just the everyday mental health problems. So like I said, we're all gonna be in that space at some point. I'm confident that the majority of us have already been there. Whether it's trauma, death, loss, divorce, whatever type of grief, we've all been in that space. So the hope is that we take action then, or even before, preventatively, where we're practicing that good self-care, so that we have strategies in place for when like things get shitty, right? We've already put together our life jacket, and so we're ready. And then we have mental illness on the far side of the continuum. Now, it's not to say if you have a mental illness that you should have done something better prior to getting there. That's not the case. We know that there's a variety of factors that impact mental illness, whether it's genetic and biological and, based on someone's environment. With that being said, one of the things is about writing narratives. And so I think it's important for all of us as we define how we work, how we show up to work, and how we pay attention to others, we get to choose and decide how we view the narrative of what we do at work that creates cultures of good mental health, and then also how you perceive and show up for those that you serve. Because if you have kind of feelings about mental illness, and most of that is based on bad experiences or struggles with family members, get that. But we naturally are going to sort of bleed that attitude onto those that we serve. They won't be able to look at us and go, yeah, they're empathetic, they're listening, they're showing up, they're validating. And so something that I did that helped me early on in my career is I just decided, you know what, people are talking about me, so I'm just gonna write a book, make sure they get it right. So then I did that, and I published this book when I was 29. And at the time, I was working in a domestic violence crisis shelter, which I absolutely loved. But I realized how fearful people are also to talk about mental health when you're doing well. We don't talk about that either. And so that was something that I really wanted to do. And so share with me, what is something, and I'm gonna ask you to lean into a little discomfort without having to disclose anything about a wackadoo uncle or anything like that. But share with me, what is an example of something that you have done to change the narrative for someone in your life? Somebody who maybe felt the shame or the judgment or the fear or didn't want to seek support or counseling or meds. Have any of you intentionally done something to shift that narrative for them?
I'll share.
Okay.
Can I have the microphone? Yeah. Okay, I come from a very snobby, elitist family, very extremely well educated, and everybody's successful. It causes a lot of stress to be able to achieve, right, at a level that matches the rest. One of my children really struggles with mental health, and we tried everything we could, try to read everything, try to get all the help we can, and the challenges just kept getting bigger and bigger, and they were just absolutely devastating to my wife and I, really hurtful, really troubling. Things would show up at our other kids' weddings where it would just be a catastrophe because since it wasn't about this one child, it was about somebody else, there was just a disruptive event. We've really struggled with that. I don't think I've ever had the guts to tell anybody other than you and the rest of my world that we go through this. Man, it is hard. And Sarah and I don't know what to do about this. We're really lost. We've tried everything we can, but we don't know really where to turn and where to get real help to help this person. And it's really not about us, but we'd like to have some comfort. We'd really like to help our child. Mm-hmm. And so we've done everything we know to do, but it's kind of like what we talk about in hospice. I'm really ignorant of the solution opportunities. Therefore, I don't know what the hell to do.
Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing. You are the proud new owner of Beautifully Bipolar, an inspiring look into mental illness. So absolutely was hoping that somebody in here had a child, whether they're under 18 or an adult person in their life, or a sibling who has had those experiences. When I was diagnosed, my parents knew nothing. Like, we didn't know anything. So the first book we ordered on bipolar disorder that showed up with UPS was Bipolar Disorder for Dummies. Like, that's where we started. So part of my company that's super cool is I have really great parents, and they share their story and are really involved in the mental health field. And so we speak all around, and we're working on a second book. And part of the thing that my parents have always talked about is you don't always get, you like have to go to work and kind of like hide it and fake it and like get through, and you don't always share the experience with others. And part of that is not knowing where the resources are, not knowing like the support and guidance to get through those challenges. So there are a lot of resources that I can provide kind of beyond the scope of here. Are you all on like with registration, an email list or something? Okay, I also have a mailing list up here if you want to add yourself. But there are great resources. The National Alliance for Mental Illness is one of them. And if you're not familiar with them, they're national, and they have classes specifically for parents who have a loved one or a child living with a mental illness. There are, local organizations, because ultimately, like, your child's mental health is impacting, or lack of mental health at this moment, is impacting all of those other experiences and situations. So thank you for showing up for them, as difficult as it may be. And please know that it can get better. And there's also a sense of ownership that I think is really difficult to get to that place. The first chapter of my book is called This Is Bullshit. So that's where I started, right? And so going through this place to be like, okay, I can do this. Like, what my experience is impacting others. And once I bought in, it was a totally different experience for me. And so that buy-in piece is so powerful. Getting folks there isn't always easy. But from a now not kid of someone who was a real difficulty on my parents, like, thank you for showing up for them. Others? Anyone else? I feel like maybe one other person was going to share. Okay. Speak now or forever hold your peace. Got it. Good. Go ahead. Oh, yeah, that might be helpful. Do you want to pass that back? Thanks.
I think I would say my sister has bipolar or had. She's no longer with us. But one of the things that I learned over the years is exactly what you just said. You can be there to support and to offer support to get them there, but they have to do the work. You can't do it for them, no matter how much you want to do that. It's not a possibility.
Yep.
So.
Yeah. And it's finding that balance between feeling confident and finding peace and grace and knowing that this is what I did. And there's a sense of like, I end here and they start there, and being okay with what that journey is for them, whether we like it or not, whether we agree with it. I know at this point, I've lost 13 people to suicide in my life. And there's so many moments where it's like, you go through that, like, but what if I coulda, shoulda, woulda? And as I've worked in the mental health field, I've really gotten to a place where it's like people have ownership of their experiences. And not everybody's recovery looks the same. So while it took years and years and years for me, some people take longer, some people take shorter. And so the hope in this conversation, well, I have a few hopes, but one of them is think about the stuff that we all have in our own lives. How do you talk about mental health in the workplace? So how many people, we have a lot of folks from out of state, is that correct? Okay, how many are Arizona people? So the majority, loner with me, okay, all right. So I want you to think about how you think about this in your own workplace. A lot of times, especially I've been in director leadership positions for the last 12 of my 14 years in the field. And there have been times where I'm like, we support our clients' health. but it was like their physical health and wellness. And we did not do a whole lot to support mental health. We didn't do a lot to ensure that we had employee assistance programs that provided therapy and counseling that was accessible. Not like, we provide this and you can get on the list and like hope you hang in there for the next 7 months because that's when the next appointment is. Or accessible doesn't mean that, yes, they provide antipsychotic meds or anti-anxiety meds, but they only cover one class of meds. So there's a lot of limitations. And so I think it's helpful for us to lean in and go like, how do we really talk about mental health? At work, if somebody is sick, is that different than if somebody's struggling with their mental health? Because oftentimes, you know, somebody makes up that they have the flu for days and days and days on end because it's not really a safe place at work to say that it's actually mental health related. So for folks here, how many of you have like a really good set in place mental health program or response? Like you have a culture where your team knows you care about their mental health because it absolutely correlates to how they show up in the workplace and their productivity, and they know how to access benefits and supports. Yeah.
So, and this is kind of a question. How do you handle, so our HR coordinator has made it very apparent we're not to talk about mental health issues. I'm just kidding. Really, I just wanted to mess with her. But I will say that she does a lot of the things, but two of the really small things that she's done, I consider them smaller because she's done bigger things, but was like walk with a coworker for 15 minutes, little things like that so that you feel more open to talk about really anything and you develop those friendships, and then also meditations. But really, I just wanted to razz her.
Nicely done. I love it. Thank you. So the other piece of that is, one, you know the availability of support, and you've already thought through like what are some tangible things that people can do. So a lot of times, have you ever noticed like when you're struggling and someone's like, let me know if I can help you? It's like the reaching out part is the hard part. So like, come here and meet me in this space where I'm at. And I think we can do that in the workplace by getting creative and how we're still getting the work done. We're still doing supervisions or meetings or check-ins, but we're doing it in a way that meets the person where they're at. And so, you know, with that, there's an organization that does a lot around workplace mental health. And they were doing this study, and they surveyed like 400 employees and said, you know, in your organization, who do you report if you need an accommodation, if you need additional support, you need time off, who do you report that to? So of course, everybody was like HR, my supervisor, or the CEO. And then they waited and they flipped that and said, who are you least likely to report living with a mental health condition or struggling in that way? And it was those top 3 things that they were like, these are the last people we would tell. And so that's that culture shift that we want to make. And so how can we be creative in talking about mental health? Because if we don't recognize that mental health, or like lack of mental health for people at different times in their life, there is a huge detriment to the bottom line of any company, agency, or organization. Mental illness is the #1 disability in the world today. So just like you're focusing on physical health at work, you know, if somebody came through the door, and this is our office space, and they came through, they had broken their leg and they're hobbling on crutches trying to get through the door, we wouldn't all sit here and go like, God, if you could just try a little harder to walk, like that would be more convenient. We wouldn't do that. But sometimes in the workplace, people are so fearful of that stigma or not knowing what they can do that they're not asking for help. So on the one side, it's not necessarily that companies aren't supportive, it's that the team or employees don't necessarily know how to ask. So recognize that there is a huge financial cost in presenteeism, absenteeism, when we're not recognizing the impact of mental illness. And so encourage equality in your workplace. So I'm trying to think, because your world is a little different than mine, and not because I'm bipolar, but think about like in your workspace, do you have numbers posted about anything? Whether it's like grief support lines or like, do you have anything like that that's publicly posted? What are they? EAP. Okay.
Telemedicine, healthcare.
Okay. Perfect.
All sorts of things.
Perfect. Awesome. So it's things like that. Like, make sure you have that available. And I encourage you to make those services available in other places besides like lobbies or waiting rooms, because one of the places that we hang flyers or post numbers is in bathrooms. If somebody goes in and finds a resource on the back of a stall, they don't have to walk out in front of everybody they work with to take that resource. So some ideas, suggestions, educate yourself. If you find out that you have a team member, obviously choosing empowerment and how you talk to them, the conversations you have as opposed to shame, is helpful, because there's already sort of shame attached to that. And then think about breaking down those job expectations. So how many of you work remote currently? Man, it's just you and I in this. Oh, we got a few others. Okay. So remote work has like its whole other, like pot of challenges. And so when somebody is struggling with their mental health, what are ways that we can break down those job expectations? So one is how you navigate the conversation. If you, during onboarding, when you hire somebody, if in that process you talk about, here at our company, we have this culture of making sure our team knows that we can openly talk about mental health struggles. You can talk to your insert person here. And even when you do like training and things like that, include portions on mental health. So if you create a culture where it's like, that's a word that people hear, it's not just stress, mental health, mental health, mental health. People all have mental health. So that's a great way to start. And then figure out how tasks are assigned. So is it that the person maybe is struggling at work because of the physical location of their desk? Does the noise feel stressful for them? Maybe you can modify scheduling. Maybe there are specific, folks that they work with that increase symptoms that they have for their mental health. So there's some different ways in how you can potentially break up those tasks and how you can either reallocate them, but also check in with that person. So rather than doing like this formal write-up, which sometimes has to happen, right? We want to have like task improvement plans and, probationary periods and things like that. But what are some examples of what you can tangibly cover with an employee or somebody in your company who's struggling with their mental health? So, and you can compare that what you would have in like an employee review. What are things you might want to consider addressing if you know someone is living with a mental health condition that they've openly talked about? So like, don't go around like diagnosing and be like, I think you're living with a mental illness and we should do this plan. What are things that y'all have done? Does anything come to mind? Yeah.
For me, it's just providing a warm, inviting environment for everybody, because we talk about death all day long, and we carry the weight of families on our shoulders when we come in, when we leave, all day. So I think as leaders, we've all worked for that one employer that we don't ever forget, who was either abusive, either were just negative all the time, always shameful. And, for me, I had that experience one time, and I told myself I will never do that again. I will never experience that. And I was in management at 21. But when I experienced that, I told myself, I will not do that. I will not belittle staff. I will not do that. There's a time and place for it, and it's how you deliver that message. And if staff feel that ease, I've been in corporate America. I know what that looks like. I don't want that. That just ease. They're going to open up, but you have to give that vibe off. If you don't, you're already setting yourself up for failure.
Absolutely. So how that conversation happens is really important. So we don't want to, like I said, go around diagnosing, and there's some like HR stuff that could get a little messy talking about medical conditions and diagnoses. However, if we can relate it to job performance. We don't have to say, the psychosis I'm witnessing you go through at work is impacting this. But you can start off with, you're an incredibly valuable part of this team. Identify some positive things that have, that they've contributed, and then share from a place of concern. I hate to say this, but even if you don't genuinely feel this concern, the way you portray the concern and that empathy is so, so important. Because not only are you helping to support that person, you're sending the message to the rest of the team about how you respond to these types of issues. And so relate job performance issues and ultimately put it back on other folks to ask what would be helpful for them. I think many times those in leadership positions come to meetings like that with a set agenda of, here's what's going to be done. These are the steps that need to happen. And not that that's bad, but if we can include that employee in those steps and modifying those steps potentially, and asking what do they feel they need from us or the team to help them be successful at work. So there's a difference between the just telling them and trying to include them. Now, you may have included this person and there have been multiple conversations. So with that, I say, I also don't believe that people living with a mental illness should be kept in the workplace doing this specific job when they can't do it over and over and over and over and over, right? So just like we don't want to tokenize people and what's it like to live with a mental illness? I'll call my one friend and I'll have them come represent everybody with a mental illness. I also think it's inappropriate, unprofessional, and not good for the business to keep somebody on staff as long as you've done your due diligence, but to keep them on staff solely because you're fearful around letting them go because of their mental illness. So, HR, y'all have the skills and expertise to navigate those situations, but that is not an empowering approach, right? And so taking kind of ownership that, yes, I'm living with a mental illness, but I still have to show up to work. I'm expected to be there at a certain time. I have, I'm grant funded, so I have numbers to meet. I have funds to allocate. And so do I sometimes go to my boss and say, hey, here's what I'm going through. I'm struggling getting this done, which never happens. But if that did happen, I could have that conversation with her. And those are the types of things that we can learn through self-advocacy. So somebody that may be struggling, same with physical health, that self-advocacy piece I think is important. And by asking them, how can I help you be successful in your job? What do you think would work? That's part of including them and helping them see if they need help, ask for help, right? Ask for help if you need it. And so how many of you have ever fallen victim to this next slide? That is that's just not my damn job. That's out of the scope of my work. I challenge you to recognize mental health as an all of us issue. And if somebody is struggling and it's not your job, somewhere along the line, what they're not able to do is going to filter and flow down to you or filter and flow down to other staff. And so having an organization or a company that has plans in place, they have strategies for talking about mental health and wellness. They have, connections with community services in their programs. The overall health of the organization is drastically enhanced. So that's why I became a social worker. From, hospitalizations and meds and self-harm and, getting withdrawn from U of A. I had a college professor my senior year. I wanted to be a teacher. And so I was struggling. I had ended a relationship. A partner died by suicide. And so I was just I'm overwhelmed. And his response to me was, girls like you with bipolar disorder aren't meant to graduate. And I was like, okay. So that shaped my perception. I dropped the class and I never became a teacher. But my thought was how many other people have heard those responses? How many of us, even unintentionally, come to this work with perceptions similar to that? So that kind of haunted me for a couple years where I really doubted, what is my role in the workplace? When do I disclose to supervisors? Should I disclose? What is the risk and reward of that? And taking that experience, you know, I always encourage folks, especially when you're in such difficult work like you are, where we can be callous, we can be burnt out, we got vicarious trauma. How can we pause and remember that like that 17-year-old me would have never made it to me today with a master's degree and a company and a book and like a life that I've built and I'm really proud of, that I worked hard for. I had to have people in my professional life believe in me and support me and like take that time for pause. And so while you do this incredible work day in and day out, anytime you feel a little crunchy or burnt out, I really hope that it can pause, even just for a brief moment. So one tool that I want to encourage you all, I can send it to you, you can look it up. I want to encourage you all to use is what we call RAP plans. Has anybody heard of a RAP plan, a wellness recovery and action plan? So this could be used in the workplace. It can be used individually for folks in their own personal lives with their friends, family, whoever they have in their world. This was something that I did with my psychiatrist early on after I was released from the hospital. The great thing is that I learned about mental illness through the perspective of a brain disorder. So that helped me separate, like, I'm not the bipolar girl and there's like the non-lunatics over there. I'm the same, and I'm the same person that I was back then, but I'm living with a medical condition that deregulates chemicals in my brain. So that helped me take that notion of like the character flaw out of it. Where when it was a medical thing, just like if I was having back surgery, I'd want to know, what's the doctor going to do? What's the healing process? Do I need meds? What's therapy like? And so that education piece is so important. And when folks are at a place where they are so struggling, they have, you know, they're in the like emergency state of mental illness or in crisis, they're not able to advocate for themselves. So think, and don't think too far because I don't want anyone to like go back to that place. But if you think about a difficult situation you had and you're in the state of trauma and you're in the state of crisis and somebody asked you like, give me directions to something in another state that you went to once, right? Like your brain is so frazzled. So it's hard to get things right when we're in trauma. So with these RAP plans, it's like 4 or 5 pages long, and it basically helps someone when times are good, when things are good, okay? So this isn't just go home, take a bubble bath, do yoga, go to the gym. I'm like, I just got out of a psych hospital. I'm not gonna go to the gym right now. Like that wasn't a helpful suggestion for me. This was a helpful suggestion. So what a RAP plan does is it gives people hope that things can get better, that they deserve to be well, and it provides, sorry, when you go to the PowerPoint so they can see it. Oh wait, I did the black screen. I didn't mean to. I said I wasn't going to do it. I did it. Personal responsibility, right? We have ownership of not only where and how we live our world, but also how we show up to work and how we respond to others. And then education. We want to learn about what mental health looks like. Educate about what services you're offering within the workplace. And then self-advocacy, I mentioned. Encourage each other and yourselves that if you need support and help, reach out for it, ask for it. Don't be afraid to talk about it. You might find you don't want to talk to certain people at work about it. That's totally okay. But identify who your support people are, and those who may be struggling that come to you, encourage them to find their support people as well. So in these RAP plans, they go, because I do want to print off a bunch of stuff because I'm like trying to save paper in this remote world. So again, I can email this to you, but these couple pages starts off with things that happen when I'm well. Here's how I feel or think or behave when life is good. And that's the very first question because that's most important because they're a person before their struggle. They're a person before their diagnosis. And then it goes on to what are the red flags? What are the indications that like I need my support people to step in? And then the next step is who are my support people? And what's contact information for them? What about medical providers? What about medication? And people can decide how much stuff they want to use. And then it goes through, if there's a reason for support to step in, what do you want them to do? What do you want them to say? Are there services you prefer over others? Like there's a hospital, which I won't name, they're like, I hope I never have to go there again. and it's been 18 years since I was hospitalized, but having this stuff written out and formulated ahead of time helps these supporters know what to do if that person's in a state of crisis and isn't able to advocate for themselves. So the same thing can be done in the workplace. So in terms of like productivity, what are indications that someone might be falling behind? They might be struggling with their mental health. Who are the people within the workplace that they're comfortable and confident talking to? What are those people? What can they do or say or take action in a way that feels safe and supportive? So a lot of this is like mental health safety planning, so to speak. So, any more questions? So with that, when we talk about self-care, like I said, it's really easy for folks to be like, take bubble baths and do yoga all the time. And I think bubble baths are great. And I think yoga is wonderful. I practice meditation every day. I take medication. I seek therapy. I exercise. I journal. I cuss. I go to concerts. Like, these are all things that I do for my own mental health and self-care. There's a difference between self-care and self-comfort, right? So like, I was drinking IPA beers last night because that's my favorite kind of beer. But if anytime I got stressed out, that was my strategy, like that would be a problem. So there are things that self-comfort is not long-term wellness for our emotional, mental, physical, or spiritual health. So when we think about self-care, this word is more than just bubble baths. This is about, are you going to your medical appointments? Are you taking care of your physical health? Are you talking to somebody beyond your partner or spouse or husband about what your experiences, what they are? And so self-care is a process, and it's something that you have to practice every single day. We don't want to wait until we're in the midst of crisis or trauma to go, what am I going to do to make myself feel better? We want to be practicing that on all the good days, so that when we need those coping strategies, we can dig into our backpack and they're already a practice, they're already a part of our life. So with that said, I leave you with this quote. This is one of the suicide awareness walks that I did for my friend John Dempsey, who we lost 2 years ago. And it says, the humanity we all share is more important than the mental illnesses we may not. And so if we can just show up to this work and the people that you serve, and I'm sure many of them are incredibly difficult, and then many of them are those folks that you will never forget. Their life, their experience, their story will stay with you forever and ever. And so I encourage us all that regardless of if we know someone living with a mental illness or it's us, ourselves, to really approach it from a humanistic perspective, and that recovery is possible. People deserve to be seen and heard, and there's hope for them in the workplace, and it's important that we provide that type of support. So I leave you with my email address. Some of the things that my company does is we provide very specific, like in-depth workplace trainings where we go through task improvement plans. We do some role plays, which I don't traditionally love, so I'm just gonna throw that out there. But walking through, what does a supportive conversation look like? Things that we can do, like, I believe you. Not that I understand, like I get cringy when they're like, I understand, because we don't. But I can understand how this would be so difficult. I'm so sorry this is happening to you. What can I do to support you? You're really brave for sharing this with me. And so we really kind of dive into that, and then also look at, from an HR perspective, how our EAP programs, only about 8% of companies utilize EAP. The companies provide them, but the employees aren't utilizing them. So doing kind of internal assessments of not only what do employees think, but why are they or are they not reaching out to services? So if you go to the website, the workplace trainings aren't listed on the website because they're specific to each organization. So we can kind of mold and shift them depending on the need. But there's some other good stuff on there. With that being said, what comments, questions, thoughts do folks have? Toll-free call, by the way. Go ahead. Oh, sorry. I keep forgetting. My bad.
So, I mean, 20, 30 minutes ago, you mentioned, if somebody was walking in the room, had a broken leg, we would all get up to help, right? At least if we have a heart.
Some of us might sit there.
Jamie would probably think twice. But what are some things that we can do to establish that somebody is mentally struggling? Like, I understand you can get to know somebody, but really, I mean, when you made that comment, it really hit, I have a hard time establishing and looking at somebody saying that person's really struggling. Sometimes you can, right? Somebody's coming in with a broken leg, they have a broken leg or something's wrong. You can help, you can see it. So what are some things that we can do as people, just in general, running into somebody at the store? Is it smiling more? I mean, sometimes when I smile, people look at me like I've got a problem.
People get a little weirded out.
Yeah, like this guy, yeah. So what are some things that we can do to reach out to people or affect them in a positive way?
Really, really good question. So the fact that you're like, I can't look at someone and tell if they're struggling, that's most often the case. So kudos to you, because you're not just like judging people as you walk around. But that's what makes mental health and wellness and mental illness so difficult, is you can't tell by the broken leg. So some of the things we can do, one, check in. So an example that comes to mind, has anybody heard of Kevin Hines before? So you can look him up online. He's brilliant. His name's Kevin Hines, Hines. And several years ago, he was living with bipolar disorder. And several years ago, he jumped off the Golden Gate Bridge and lived. So he's now a public speaker and shares his story about what that experience was like. And he talked about, he took a taxi to a bus and then walked down the bridge. And there were so many people that came up to him, or so many people he interacted with, and he was crying. And he's like, if one person would have just said hi, if one person would have checked in, I would have felt seen. To where he was sitting on the bus and the bus driver was like, hey, you have to get off now. And he's crying, didn't say anything. Then another person came up, he's crying, and they said, hey, can you take our picture? And so all these different instances happened. And I think people living with mental health conditions have that perception of like, I'm invisible, nobody cares, like I'm lost in this world. I don't know how to help. I don't know what help I need. So checking in and just asking people how they're doing. Follow through. Reach out to the people in your life. I find that it's those who are, the stiff upper lip. They act like they're happy all the time. They keep it together. Those often are the ones we got to check in with the most. So I think checking in, I think also being mindful of the language that you use when you talk about mental health. Make sure that you're not contributing to stigma by using words like crazy and lunatic and the weather is so bipolar. And I was like, oh, I can't believe that's still a thing. We're still using that one. It should come up with something better. But like these comparisons and how we talk about mental health and wellness, and know that like the person sitting next to you or the person at the grocery store, like we don't know their experience. And so checking in, I mean, smiling, it sounds really silly, but like that helps, but we're wearing masks. So you might have to like hold that one until the world's in a different place. Making sure if you're talking about mental illness, you're talking about it in a positive way of like, it's a medical condition. It's real, it's common, it's treatable, recovery is possible. Things that you can say, like I had mentioned, are you okay? Is there something I can do to support you? You can point out behaviors or things that you're seeing that maybe cause concern without placing judgment or blame or shame. And then even in the context of language, like we've really shifted away from using committed suicide, and we use died by suicide or took their own life, because committed is ultimately directly connected to like sin or a criminal, like a crime. And so that criminality surrounding suicide can make it really difficult for people to talk about. So at the end of the day, think about what you would need or want if you were in the dumps. What would be helpful for you? Flip that around. Remember that you don't have to have all the things or, the expertise just to check in on another person and see if they're okay. The last piece to that, educate yourself on what's available in your community. Know what the helplines are. Know what some of mental health conditions look like. Know depression can be, here's the symptoms. Know that anxiety can look like, here's the symptoms. Those are some things so that as you're walking around, you're kind of like a walking resource. You may know what to look for. And if you ask someone if they're okay and they say, I'm great, you tried, you moved on, and maybe they are great. But then you also have knowledge about what's available in your community. Good question.
I feel like I'm like perfectly placed as HR to open the conversation for that, and my door's open. We have an open door policy, and I feel like, I mean, by the number of people that come in my office, I feel like it's pretty open. Where I struggle is with, we had several people work remote for a long time, and there are some that are still working remote. And when they had the option to come back, and we have, safeguards in place and things like that. But I have gotten some complaints or concerns, like I'm feeling disconnected, and I send out emails that probably so many people do not read, because like mental health stuff, you know what I mean? Like, and I can only do what I can do, and I send it to them, so I try to help, but I struggle with that, and there's also judgment on my part. Then come back into the office and be a part of, you know what I mean? So I really have a hard time with, and I talk them through it and try and do what I can and say, well, join the challenges that we're doing, and you can still do that remote. But there's a disconnect there that I'm not sure how to address. Yeah. Any suggestions?
One, I mean, certainly document, which in HR I'm sure you're already doing. One, it's like better understanding and recognize what their capacity is, where their strengths are, what they're struggling with. Can things be shifted or moved around? Or, if they're remote, that creates an innate sense of isolation and disconnect from any organization, because no matter how many Zoom calls you do or virtual gatherings or team building events, when you're not in that same space, it's just going to be different. And so if they're not interested in coming back and it's impacting job performance, like I said, I think there's a place to where we end and they begin, and ultimately they have some choice in the decisions they make, that if their options are to be in the office or work remote, either way, they still are expected to complete their work. So if there's specific accommodations that can be made, great. If those have been made and that's still not working, again, we don't want to handhold anybody. However, we want to recognize that whatever support you would offer to somebody with a physical illness or disability or living with whatever, we want to offer that same type of grace. But again, it doesn't mean that you can't take action in determining if that's an appropriate position for them if you're kind of having this conversation over and over and over and over again. So it might be, if you do have to move someone to a different department or let them go or this, that, and the other, recognize how challenging that could be for them and do like strategy for as they transition out of that position. What services might there be? What might that look like? I think the less sudden change for folks is often better. But if folks continue to work remotely, some people thrive remote and others don't. So, it's kind of a case by case basis, and trust your gut, trust your experience. You've, as HR, you know what you're doing, but when it comes to these types of issues, it adds a different caveat, because this is a different world we've been living in for the last, year and a half or so. Yeah.